Your world, your challenges, your faith. When faith within engages the world without, there's power. It's living life from the inside out.
We feel off balance, stressed, even shaken when our routines and relationships are disrupted. And for many of us, this pandemic is the greatest disruption of our lives. There are mental health repercussions for this kind of stress. So how does faith in Jesus and how do the congregations we're part of meet us and guide us in times like these? And how do we contribute to the welfare of others? That's what we're talking about today on the Family Life Inside Out interview podcast. I'm Martha Manikas Foster, and my guest is Dr. Walter Kim. He's a pastor in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. For almost 80 years, the NAE has been connecting and representing evangelical Christians in the United States. Welcome, Dr. Kim, to Inside Out.
Thank you very much.
I know that when I say that COVID-19 is affecting our mental health, for some people that's going to sound some alarms, but I think that we can all agree that some of us are worrying more, some of us are leaning toward depression, and a lot of us can't seem to shake anxiety. Why do you think the pandemic's throwing us off, first of all? And what are some of the understandable but still concerning ways that we're reacting?
Martha, these are really great questions, and they get to the fact that this pandemic that we're in is not simply a physical pandemic. It's an emotional and spiritual pandemic in the sense that the amount of stress that's produced by either the actual loss of work or the potential loss of work, by the shifting of routines, by finding ourselves closeted at home. And of course, the uncertainty of when this will ever end and in what ways can we move toward that produce all sorts of stresses. I think there are two theological reasons that we experience stress. One is humans are made to connect. So ever since the Garden of Eden, when Adam, who was without sin, and the garden was without yet stain, God still said in that moment, it is not good for Adam to be alone.
Right.
So here, the perfect human man, God said, even in Eden, he needed a partner. And so we're made to connect, and things that disrupt connections are going to profoundly impact how we relate to the world, to ourselves, and to one another, because we're made to connect. The second reason is that humans are not only made to connect, they're made to have rhythms. I think of the Old Testament rhythms that included daily offerings, weekly Sabbaths, monthly celebrations, and annual feasts. And they're given to us because God made us as creatures of habit. Even the adventure seekers among us have daily routines that give us structure. And that's precisely what's been disrupted as well. Our daily routines of life, the ways we go about work and relating to our family, the patterns. So when we disrupt human connection, when we disrupt our rhythms, we're disrupting things that are part of what it means to have been created in the image of God.
Wow.
And so that is deeply, deeply unsettling, and it shows up in a variety of ways. And stresses in marriage. I've talked to a number of pastors who said, when we finally come out of this pandemic and are starting to get together, my first sermon series is going to be on marriage.
Yes.
Because we're all going to need some marriage counseling. We're all going to need to work through issues that we've discovered during these months together.
Right.
And so the stress will show up in some fashion, and that's perfectly normal because it's God's way of indicating to us something's going on here, and the stressful responses are God's warning signals that we should be paying attention.
And do you think we are?
I think in large part, many of us are becoming much more comfortable within the church talking about issues of mental health and emotional health. In fact, the NAE, our fall magazine, will be focused specifically on this issue of mental and emotional health. A whole magazine edition will be focused on this.
That's wonderful.
And what we're discovering is that pastors now are seeking for resources to not only equip themselves in providing trauma care, but equip the congregation for gaining the language to even speak about the emotional disruption in their lives. And this has become a critical concern. We recently surveyed a number of our denominational leaders within the NAE network, and mental health issues were listed as a particular concern.
So we're talking about the changes in the rhythms of our life, and we're talking about, maybe even becoming more aware of the things that are stress points for us and places where communication breaks down. And this is true for everybody. But what additional pressures are pastors and church staff facing right now, do you think?
I think the sense in which pastors desire to provide care is increased, but the avenues to provide that care have decreased.
Yes.
So pastors, they're in the ministry because they love God and love people. And when a crisis rolls around, the deepest instinct is to be physically present, to be able to pray with the laying on of hands, to be able to look someone in the eye and share words of comfort, or to provide the shoulder, on which to cry. And those things that are often the most important things that provide in terms of crisis are precisely the things that pastors are not able to provide as we are socially distanced. And so there's this disconnect between the increased urge to provide pastoral care, but the decreased avenues to provide that care. So pastors are needing to become extremely creative in what we can communicate online, or find ways in shaping sermons that are providing more general pulpit pastoral care, and shaping small groups in a fashion that are intentionally designed not merely to convene people, but to get honest about life. And so we're discovering, many pastors are discovering that small group ministries, even through the Zoom, are becoming a lot more real as people are concluding, we can't waste time. We got to get to the real issues of life that we're struggling with, and let's take a risk and be vulnerable.
So I have a friend who's a chaplain in hospice, and she's trying to do this job that is very much in person, but not being in person until the very last moment of a person's life. How in general does a pastor respond personally to these walls being put up? I realize they have to be more creative, but what's the emotional response sometimes?
There is an emotional toll. So one of the things that we're starting to provide are these care packages, the NAE care package, which includes 3 types of resources. One is guidance on financial stability, because there are economic challenges that many churches are facing in terms of making budget. The other is developing pastoral resilience, so a set of resources that work through what does it mean to become resilient during this time. The third resource is trauma care. And what we've discovered is we had originally intended this to be training for pastors to provide trauma care for their congregations, recognizing that whether it's a care group in a group discussion or one-on-one, seeking to provide emotional support during traumatic experiences. What we discovered is a lot of the pastors actually were signing up for themselves. We're signing up to experience a safe place to work out their concerns, their own sense of being overwhelmed with the amount of pastoral care that's required, and not knowing if there would be an end and when that end to that kind of crisis mode of life would come. And so I think one of the most important things that we can be telling our pastors is it's okay. It's okay to be experiencing this. You should be experiencing this. There's no shame in this. You shouldn't have a Messiah complex that you should be able to fix everyone else's problems without having a problem yourself. That we are all wounded healers. We're healers that experience wounds ourselves, and out of that woundedness are able to provide hope for others in their hurt.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Let me just reset this. If you're just joining us, you're listening to the Inside Out podcast on family life. I'm talking today with Dr. Walter Kim, president of the National Association of Evangelicals. Dr. Kim, Scripture includes cries from people who love God and still sound anxious or depressed. I'm thinking of the Psalms of Lament, but that's, of course, not the only place that we see that. So we know that God doesn't disown us for having these kinds of feelings. But what can we do about it? What steps can we take to find God's peace? And how do we find a sense of balance? What can pastors do, and what can the rest of us do? I think you've alluded to it in these care packages, but as people are listening to you right now, what would you suggest?
I would say first, acknowledge the challenge. Acknowledge that you're going through something extremely difficult. Acknowledge that there are psalms of lament that exist, and God gives us permission to experience those psalms. Second is recognize you're not alone. So much of the struggle is exacerbated because we struggle in our own head. And if that's the place of a disorientation, then we need to have outside voices. We need to have others that we can bring into the conversation.
Which is part of the problem to begin with, right? Because we feel isolated, because we are isolated. Yeah, okay.
That's right. That's right. And the third thing is, I would say, let go of shame. I think one of the greatest obstacles to receiving support, counseling in mental health or emotional health issues is the sense that you should be ashamed at somehow being deficient or not more capable of handling the situation. And that's not the case at all. In fact, there was a recent study that was done that described the number of people who believed that they would not be accepted if they acknowledged a mental health struggle at church,
right?
Because of the perception that the church is a place where people are put together. You know, you look at a worship service and everyone looks like they have their act together. And yet the church is a hospital. It's a spiritual hospital. It's a place where sinners come in their brokenness and find a God who welcomes them just as they are, and seeks to walk with them in the midst of that struggle. And so letting go of the sense of shame and pursue those resources, pursue help. 68% of churches, pastors say that they have an array of resources available for mental health counseling, either directly at their church or in partner relationships. So, nearly 70% of churches have readily available counseling resources, but only 28% of congregants actually know that their churches have such resources.
Why
so
is
there's
that?
clearly a disconnect between the amount of resources that actually exist and the amount of resources that are known to exist. And we need to close that gap. We need to recognize that there's a lot of help to be had out there.
You're not talking about creating the help. You're talking about an awareness of the help that exists, right?
That's exactly right. The help is there. We just need to make that connection, that introduction.
Well, I hope that we do. I hope that we do. In general, and well past COVID, but especially now, I hope we make that connection. So to bring this all together and maybe to summarize things that you've already said, Dr. Kim, how would you encourage the people listening right now who are feeling shaken by COVID-19 and all of the ripple effects of life during a pandemic?
Yeah. So in my office, on the table, I have this piece of artwork. It's a small ceramic bowl that was given to me as a gift by some colleagues at church. And it's made in what's called the kintsugi style of art, right? So it's a Japanese style of art in which broken pieces of pottery are mended by these seams of lacquer and gold. And so instead of thinking about these broken pieces as something that should be discarded, they're actually brought back together. And the seams, rather than being hidden, are actually featured as something beautiful. And I often will take that bowl out in the middle of the day of ministry, and I'll look at it as a physical parable that God is in the business of taking broken jars of clay and bringing something beautiful out of that. Of reforging our lives by not denying the brokenness, but by redeeming the brokenness and refashioning it, taking the shards of an old creation and making a new creation out of our lives. And I find it deeply encouraging to the work of ministry to recognize that we all are jars of clay, fragile, with broken seams in there, and that God is not ashamed of us, but is in the business of refashioning us and filling us up with his Spirit and a treasure that reflects God's all-surpassing power. So, yes, there is a need for honesty about our hurt, but there's a tremendous hope that we have in Christ.
Mm-hmm. What a beautiful image. I'm a potter, in addition to talking to you here now on the radio, and while I don't do the kintsugi method, I do use broken pots to make mosaics. And while it doesn't emphasize the edges, the broken edges, it does bring broken things together into something beautiful. So yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for that image, and thank you for your wisdom. And we will have a link on our podcast page so that people can get in touch with the NAE and see some of your resources. I thank you so much for sharing all of that and being with me today, Dr. Kim.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
My guest has been Dr. Walter Kim, President of the National Association of Evangelicals. You'll find a link to the NAE's COVID-19 resources for churches right where you find all Inside Out podcasts at fln.org/insideout. I'm Martha Manikas Foster with Inside Out on Family Life.